Next lecture in module 2. So critical thinking, I have thinking with complexity, um, meaning looking at something, not taking something at face value. By the way, I urge you to take some notes as I talk because it's going to help you with taking the test, with the quizzes, the weekly quizzes. But to think with complexity, to look at something in more an in-depth way, um, and not just take things for face value. So, for example, a critical thinker would not just take media as entertainment, but would look more deeply at that and say, okay, what is the agenda they have? What is the message they're trying to communicate? Are they trying to indoctrinate me? Do they have a certain philosophical framework or a certain worldview or certain religious worldview that's undergirds that particular movie or that particular show that you're watching, or even songs? And critical thinking, it's not critiquing things just for the sake of critiquing, but it's thinking deeply, exploring the multiple dimensions of an issue. In our text, page 23, the term critical has several meanings. The most common meaning is to find fault, to judge, or to criticize. However, this is not the way we use the term here in this class. When we use critical, we refer to an intellectual skill of analysis. We refer to an intellectual skill of analysis, critical thinking, as well as to a body of scholarship, critical theory. Critical thinking is a general approach, which means to think with complexity, to go below the surface when considering an issue, and as I said, explore dimensions and nuances. Critical theory, I talked about that. It's a scholarly approach that analyzes social conditions within, listen to this, a historical, cultural, and ideological context. So when we look at the world, we don't just see it for face value. We say, what's the history behind that? When we talk about sexism and gender and women's rights, what's the history beyond that? How do we get to the situation we are today? How do we get to where there are still an overwhelming amount of male principals in leadership positions at schools, or college presidents are mostly male? What is the history beyond that? You have female college presidents, but overwhelmingly we think of it as a male's job, and that's not really necessarily has to be the case. Women are just as capable, obviously, it goes without saying. So what's the history behind that? What's the culture behind that? What's the ideological context? That's the critical thinking idea, going deeper, a tool that can be used in thinking critically. That's kind of a self-explanatory statement there, but look at this next, examining the deepest aspects of how society works. So when we talk about race, we're going to look at the history behind it. How are schools unjust today? How is there a racial disparity? How is there an achievement gap today? There's history behind on that. As Americans, we tend to look at things ahistorically. We don't look at things from a historical standpoint. And so when we see somebody talking about racism, we say, well, racism was a thing of the past. It happened during slavery, happened during the civil rights movement. But what we fail to think about is how history impacted how we got to where we are today. Thinking critical about knowledge. There's a misconception that knowledge we study in school is a set answer that stays the same. If you are taking the approach here in this class that there's a right or wrong answer, you're a black and white thinker, a lot of our math majors or engineering majors or business folks, you're used to thinking of things black and white. You're used to saying, what's the right answer? When we take a test, you feel more comfortable. And your science folks, my science folks as well, you say, what's the right answer? I just need to know the right answer. Well, sometimes it's not that straightforward. The right answer is not always apparent. You know, sometimes there's some gray areas. Everything is not black and white. And so knowledge we study in school, there's not a set answer. Knowledge changes over time. So, for example, this is an example from the book. Humans used to believe the Earth was the center of the universe. And I'm pretty sure in those days, scientists thought that, and I know they did. Scientists thought that, and that was considered the quote-unquote truth. But as science advanced and we begin to know more things, then we begin to say, that the earth is round. Well, so I'm mixing two metaphors together, but we thought the earth was the center of the universe, but after a while, we begin to say, no, there's a whole solar system. And I also wanted to use the analogy of the flat earth narrative. So that's kind of where I was going with that. But let me back up. We used to think the earth was the center of the universe, but now we know there are other planets and there are other solar systems, plural. Another truth, quote unquote truth, we thought was that the earth was flat. But after scientific exploration, we begin to realize that the earth was indeed round. Critically thinking involves looking deeper into the facts taught in school. But so I always say the textbook is not the gospel truth. Even with the textbooks I use in this class, they're tools. So we were taught especially in elementary, that if the textbook says it's the final answer, but critical thinkers want to go beyond that. When you take graduate courses, those that plan to go to graduate school, you'll do this kind of thinking quite a bit, especially your graduate seminar classes. I had a lot of philosophy. I had a lot of history in my grad studies, and we always begin to even analyze the textbook. What is the political leaning of the author? What is the ideology that the author is coming from? Is the author coming from a Marxist perspective? Is he coming from a even religious Christian perspective or a Muslim perspective? So in what context are they writing this textbook? A good example that's related to this class is the early histories. If you would have read American history in the late 19th century and early 20th century, you read about race and what they said about slavery. They often would paint slavery in from a positive perspective, especially during the time of slavery in the antebellum South, when the historians wrote about slavery. It was written from a slave master's perspective. So therefore, they're going to present it in the best light possible. So it's always in the eye of the beholder. That's what critical thinking does. It looks at that document and says, this is bias. So dimensions of critical thinking, to seek ideas that question what is thought to be common sense. So we walk around saying, well, that's common sense. That's common sense. Well, that changes. Common sense depends on the person that's saying it. And so keep that in mind. We're going to just critique that notion. To understand the history and culture where bits of knowledge come from. And like I just said, when we talked about, I gave the example of slavery. If we're coming from a slave perspective, or perspective of the slave master, that's going to affect how the literature is taught. If you're reading a piece by a Nazi, that's going to affect to the extent that the knowledge is put forth, the history. If Nazis write a particular history, it's going to be biased. And it's going to be skewed with Nazism, Nazi ideology. Same with the Taliban. Their literature is going to be skewed with Taliban, the Taliban rhetoric or Al-Qaeda rhetoric. And same with white supremacy. There's white supremacist literature that's been circulated on college campuses, and it's very skewed. And so that gives you a sense of critical thinking and the notion of critical theory. It comes from a particular philosophical framework. I talked about that a little bit earlier from the Frankfurt School. So critical thinking in relation to this class, it is common sense that people should not believe in discrimination. So we know that. But sometimes we discriminate without realizing it. Critical thinking would determine that most discrimination is not on purpose. We do not even realize it. Most people would say, I don't have a prejudice bone in my body. I mean, but nowadays you have people that are overtly white supremacists. There's a rise of young people that are joining hate groups. A lot of young men, they go to prison and they have the prison gangs, and many times in many parts of the country, they are segregated by race. So you have Latino gangs, you have African-American gangs, then you have now the white gangs, white supremacy. And a lot of people are indoctrinated into that belief system in prison or through just rhetoric and literature, as I was saying. And so they would be overtly prejudiced. But the average person that's sane, I would say, they don't want to be thought of as prejudiced or racist. And people will say I have a prejudice bone in my body. But this class, this is about looking at our own biases. So I encourage you just to put your guard down. Don't have this fear of being indoctrinated by liberal bias. I think that's going to hinder you. Think about this as a philosophical class, philosophy, social theory, or social philosophy. And that's the foundation of it. In fact, a lot of my training was in social theory. So this is what I was getting at. I was jumping ahead of myself, talking about critical theory. It refers to a body of scholarship that examines how society works. And it's a tradition that emerged about the early part of the 20th century from a group of scholars at a place called the Institute for Social Research in Frankfurt, Germany. And you'll hear people also call it the Frankfurt School. It's a series of thinkers. People like Habermas, Marcuse. If you're interested in this, I'm just kind of giving you some names of the theorists to look more into. Habermas, Marcuse. My favorite from this tradition is Gramsci, Antonio Gramsci. Now, Gramsci was an interesting young man. He died at 39, and he wrote a piece called Prison Notebooks. He talked about the notion of hegemony, and he talked about some really important ideas about freedom. And so he was one of the early critical theorists. And so if you're interested in this body of research, you can read further. And I can also recommend you some books. It has all kind of implications. And one of Theodore Adorno, page 26, deals with some of the authors, the philosophers from this movement. Mark Horkheimer, I need to slow down. Theodore Adorno, Habermas, Walter Benjamin, Marcuse, and they influenced people like Emil Durkheim. You probably read him from sociology. Max Weber. I'm also one of the early. I would also put. He's not from the Frankfurt School, but you should check out W.E.B. Du Bois and his work on double consciousness and his sociological work. It really fits in this tradition. He was doing it earlier than the Frankfurt School. At any rate, I said too much there. These theorists' work was guided by the belief that society should work towards the ideas of equality and social betterment. So they thought that society should not just accept the status quo, but they should work for equality for women and people of different races and classes and creeds and et cetera and so forth. The critical theory analysis expands all the time and deepens as theorists from indigenous, post-colonial, and other perspectives add different layers. Indigenous meaning, what's the Native American perspective? A lot of times we looked at Native Americans as a people of the past, and they stop existing after the West was won, et cetera, and so forth. But there's a whole tradition of Native Americans. We just don't live in a part of the country where there's a huge population of them. Now, some of us have Native American ancestry, but if you go out west, you meet people that are Navajo, Cherokee, Creek, Seminole, and so they still live on. That influences critical theory. Fighting for those rights. You probably remember the Standing Rock controversy. That's still ongoing. So why theory matters? Because, it seems like in these intellectual climates in the university, we're just theorizing just for the sake of theorizing. But theory without practice is ineffective. So it's important because we all operate from theory, but we don't even recognize it. We look at something and we engage how and why. You see a person walking down the street, and they have a bright green purse with glitter all over it, for example. That seems pretty bizarre. You see a young lady. Or a man with a purse. You theorize. You say, okay, why does he have that purse? And if you have some biases, you're going to say, well, a guy shouldn't have a purse. If you're a traditional person in that way. That's kind of a crude example, but you start theorizing. Like, okay, maybe that's his sister's purse, or maybe that's his purse. But I'll give you a more, so you won't freak out, I'll give you a more, a different example. You see a person driving down the street going the wrong way, on a one-way. You start theorizing and say, maybe that person is from another country, and they don't understand our quote-unquote our laws here, and or maybe they're lost, or maybe they didn't realize that they were going down the wrong way. You start theorizing automatically. We all have theory, except that to say that there are people like the Frankfurt School that spend their whole life theorizing and looking at the world. Theorizing is when a theory can be conceptualized as the learned cultural maps we follow to navigate and make sense of our lives. So we learn culture map, we learn how to process things. We're taught, okay, with a certain framework, how to see the world. And we see that as the truth, and that's common sense. But if we were in like an African country, they would have a different understanding of the world. If we were in Wakanda, if you ever seen, for you fans of Black Panther, they would have a different framework for looking at things. They would have a different ideology. They would have to have a different worldview. If you saw Black Panther, you notice that they had a whole non-Western religious system that would make some Christian folks uncomfortable. They talked about ancestor worship and things like that. So, interesting. Knowledge construction. This is something that will be an ongoing theme in the class. How is knowledge produced? So, take a textbook. I'm a history teacher. I'm a history professor. That's my training. I'm actually the social studies and history professor here on campus. I teach in College of Education. And we talk a good deal about history. So think about your textbook. Who wrote the textbook? Generally, and I'm going to venture out and say mostly it's white males that write textbooks. Now that's changing a bit. Sometimes every now and then a Caucasian female will be a part of that writing team. But for the most part, it's white males, and most of your history teachers are white males. Why is that? Because a lot of times because of systemic issues, systemic racism, even not even intentional, but some folks are just excluded out of certain professions systemically. But so think about when they write that knowledge, how it's going to be biased. It's going to not always be considered issues of Native American rights or Chinese Americans or the plight of African Americans. It's going to be that's why the early textbooks, many times you just have one sentence about African American history, and the understanding was that Black history, Native American history, even women's history was not important. Even the challenges of women's rights was not important in the textbook. And so it was mostly about white males, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson. Not to say those individuals aren't important, but his story. It's about men. And not to say that's bad, but it just needs to be more complex. So that's an analysis of knowledge construction. How is it produced? Who produced it? Why did they produce it? What did they highlight? What did they privilege? What things did they downplay? That's important. A key element to injustice is the idea that particular knowledge is objective, neutral, and universal. So it perpetuates injustice when we say this is knowledge that's important. This other knowledge over here about Native American history, Native American culture is not important. Women's history is not important. They were in the subtext. They were in the background. That perpetuates injustice. So that's why we say knowledge construction is connected to injustice. How knowledge is produced is connected to injustice. Is objectivity desirable or possible? So we always say I'm being objective. Do you think that's completely possible? I believe some level of objectivity is possible, but everything is subjective. Even myself, when I'm teaching a class like this, I have a certain bent, and I try to remain objective, and the best I can. I don't favor certain things. Like for example, I come from my worldview is Christianity, and so that's going to affect ways that I teach. For example, I'm going to privilege love. I'm going to privilege ideas of fairness. I'm going to privilege ideas of unity and that togetherness, whereas other belief systems may not always privilege those kinds of things. I'm going to champion the notion of family. I'm going to champion the notion of, like I said, unity and being kind to people. It's important for me that I'm fair, that I have integrity, that I don't cheat, that I'm honest. All those are what are considered Christian principles. Now, they may have some other, be extended to other belief systems. So that's going to always affect what I do. But do you know that there are certain religious belief systems out there that champion revenge and getting even? That's not me. So objectivity is very difficult. Socially constructed, reflective of values. So when something is socially constructed, it's reflective of the values and interests of those who produce it. The knowledge construction. Given that the transmission of knowledge is an integral activity in schools, critical scholars in the field of education have been especially concerned with how knowledge is produced. I'm saying more about knowledge construction. These scholars argue that a key element of social injustice involves the claim that particular knowledge is objective. An approach based on critical theory calls into question the idea that objectivity is even desirable or possible. When we refer to knowledge as socially constructed, we mean that knowledge is reflective of the values. Now, listen to this. When we refer to knowledge as socially constructed, we mean that knowledge is reflective of the values and interests of those who produce it. So the textbook writer, if you're reading the textbook on American history from the 1920s, when in the South, when racial prejudice was overt and they were lynching African Americans, it's going to be very biased towards African Americans. And so that's what we mean by that. In understanding knowledge as socially constructed, critical educators guide students along three fronts. Critical analysis of knowledge claims that are presented as objective, neutral, and universal. For example, Christopher Columbus's quote, unquote, discovery of America. Okay, that's from his perspective. Critical self-reflection, this is important, about their own social perspective and subjectivity. And so we have to practice critical self-reflection, looking at ourselves and not other people. About what perspective do we come from? What is our subjectivity? For example, how the Columbus myth and the teacher's racial identity influence what they know and teach about the history of North America. So how does our racial identity, you education majors out there, how does our racial identity influence the way we teach? And it does. And if you say it doesn't, then you're never going to get past that precipice, that fault line. And thirdly, developing the skills with which to see, analyze, and challenge ideological domination. To challenge ideological domination. For example, rewriting existing school lesson plans or curricula to reflect the complexities of the myth of discovery and the political implications in the myth. So, okay. Critical educators, students alone, a guy, and I talked about this. I'm getting ahead of myself. I keep doing that. I've gone over this. Claims presented as objective, neutral, universal. Example, quote, discovery of America. This is what I've just said. So this gives you an idea of what I just said in the previous slide. It's just typed out. Self-reflection is important. Those three fronts, developing the skills with which to see, analyze, and challenge ideological domination. Okay. James Banks is one of the foremost scholars in multicultural education and also dealing with knowledge construction. See page 28 through 31. Personal and cultural knowledge, popular knowledge, mainstream academic knowledge, school knowledge, transformative academic knowledge. These are important in understanding the notion of knowledge. Personal and cultural knowledge refers to the explanations and interpretations people acquire from their own personal experiences in their homes, with their families and community cultures. So what you're taught at home, what you're taught at your place of worship, in Sunday school, what you're taught, the shows that you watch with your family. Do you watch Grey's Anatomy around the TV? Do you watch Empire? That's going to all influence your cultural knowledge. Do you watch Gilmore Girls, or did you grow up watching old episodes of The Cosby Show? That's going to influence your thinking and even the books you read. So that's personal knowledge. Personal and cultural knowledge is transferred both explicitly, such as direct lessons taught by family members, or what constitutes politeness, for example, making eye contact with the elders. That's not always polite in many other cultures. As well as it's taught implicitly through messages such as what isn't talked about. Popular knowledge is another one. Refers to facts, beliefs, and various character and plot types that are institutionalized within television, movies, other forms of mass-mediated popular culture. So if you watch a lot of films, for example, often the criminal and the thug is the African American. You watch movies like Menace to Society, Boys in the Hood. There's a type of voyeurism where America likes to see the violent black male. There's a lot of films that's like that. Training Day. You know the film that Denzel Washington, as talented as he is, got a claim for was Training Day, when he played a thug cop. And so there's this narrative. Popular knowledge just teach us certain things about women, in videos, for example, where we see a lot of women, the video vixen that's dressed provocatively, and these values are transferred to us. Concepts such as the ideal family are other examples. Normal relationships, normal families, quote unquote, the husband and the wife, versus like those that live in, there are other kinds of families, those that live with the grandmother, those that live with the auntie, etc. and so forth. The single moms, but the normal family is presented as husband and wife, father and mother, 3 kids, 3.5 kids, as they say. We're also taught which neighborhoods are dangerous, are standardized through ongoing representations in popular culture. Because popular knowledge is widely shared, it serves as a common vocabulary and reference point. For instance, you might remember where you were when you first heard about the death of Prince or David Bowie. Mainstream academic knowledge refers to the concepts, theories, paradigms, and explanations that make up the traditional and established canon in behavioral and social sciences. The university knowledge, school knowledge. This type of knowledge is based on the belief that there is an objective truth, and that with the right procedures and methods, it is possible to attain truth. Now, I do believe in the idea of absolute truth because of the framework I come from. But also, a lot of times we say things are truth, and like the objective truth, it can be challenged. And that's what I want you to think about in this class. School knowledge refers to the facts and concepts presented in textbooks, teachers' guides, and other aspects of the formal curriculum designed for use in schools. A lot of our history comes from this. Many students are socialized to not question the textbook, but rather to accept it uncritically. Questioning school knowledge is often penalized, low grades, low test scores, tracking, reprimand. And then there's transformative academic knowledge. Now remember, this is all coming from James Banks. His ideas, knowledge typology is what he calls it. This is from page 30 and 31 if you want to go back and refer to it. Transformative academic knowledge refers to the concepts and explanations that challenge mainstream academic knowledge that expand the canon. That's what we're doing here. So, for example, I'll give you some academic examples of transformative knowledge. The established canon comes from a Western paradigm. Books like Plato's Republic, and later books like Huck Finn and Tom Sawyer's and War and Peace and Les Miserables. These books that are considered like the best books in history. You could put many more there. But nowadays, scholars are starting to add scholars of color to that list and saying they also have great literary works as well. Okay. I took way too long on that. I apologize, folks. Knowledge is socially constructed. What people know is based on where they come from. So if you grew up in a rural area, you're going to have that perspective. So you're going to have a perspective of a farming community. Often is racially homogenous, at least in the Kentucky area. And Gene Onion study talks about what is knowledge. And this is from the chart. I think this is interesting. From page 32, he looks at how people process knowledge from different areas. Now, this can be challenged, but I think it gives us something to think about and something to work from. Children from poor areas, working class, for example, they describe knowledge as remembering things. If you ask them the question, what is knowledge? Answering questions. Children from upper class schools, thinking up ideas and finding what is wrong with them. That's critical thinking. It's a middle class value of figuring things out and knowing them really, really well. Okay, even how knowledge itself is perceived is different from various social classes. Another question, where does knowledge come from? The working class folks, teachers, books, scientists, the Board of Education. Upper class people and what they do, your head, something you learn. So in the upper class, you initiate it. You're from a position of power. The working class look at knowledge as given to them from on high, so to speak. Could you make knowledge? Another question. Working man said, many said no or don't know. One said no because the Board of Ed makes knowledge. The upper class, yes. many said you can make knowledge by inventing things, thinking of something to discover them. So just in wrapping up, it is not my intention to go this long. I'm really going to try to endeavor to make it shorter, but I want you to think about critical thinking. These are just ideas to help you process the class better and make you smarter and more intelligent about these kinds of things. Once again, I want to reiterate, this is not a class to argue and defend your point. You're going to miss the whole point. If you feel like your goal is to right all the wrongs of the conservatives in society or all of the liberal snowflakes in society, and it's your job to jump on Facebook and come to classes like this and school everybody, that's a very immature perspective. It just flat out is. You're missing the whole point. So, but until next time, we will chat later.